Evening. Tonight I'm going to read to you the poem, The Man Who Lived in Leeds. Now some say this rhyme doesn't mean anything. Others are not so sure. There was a man who lived in Leeds. He filled his garden full of seeds, and when the seeds began to grow, it was like a garden filled with snow. But when the snow began to melt, it was like a ship without a belt. And when the ship began to sail, it was like a bird without a tail. And when the bird began to fly, it was like an eagle in the sky. And when the sky began to roar, it was like a lion at my door. And when the door began to crack, it was like a knife right in my back. And when my back began to bleed, I was dead, dead, dead indeed.
Manic expressions, 31 days of Halloween.
Greetings and happy Halloween. I'm your host, The Second Opinion, and today I'm here to say that while I appreciate a good horror movie as much as the next guy, it's important this Halloween season to not forget the value of a good scary story. Case in point, scary stories to tell in the dark. Now these stories were, and remain, pretty popular and pretty controversial. They're gory, gross, pretty cheesy, and sometimes pretty creepy too. But just how well do they hold up? We're going to look at them today and find out. So sit back and enjoy Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. The first chapter is called so named because every story is meant to end with a jump scare from the reader, either screaming or jumping at the people listening. To read them would be far too repetitive, but almost all of them are great stories to scare your friends with, and right away you can appreciate the effect the pictures add. Nice and ominous, and pretty morbid too. Now granted, there are exceptions like Old Woman All Skin and Bone, which is a not so creepy story about a graveyard, and possibly The Walk, but it also has such classics as The Big Toe. You've probably all heard this story, or at least something like it, about a kid who finds something unusual, in this case a big toe, and disposes of it, only to hear a mysterious figure calling for it later that night, getting closer and closer until they're right at the foot of their bed. This version, however, also includes an alternate ending.
Strange noises ever since I found the toe. I'm gonna keep the camera all night here, just in case it picks something up. What do you have such big eyes for?
To look you through and through.
What do you have such big claws for?
To hold on tight.
What do you have such a big mouth for?
To swallow you whole! Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near the post office talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark it was hard to tell for sure. Then it was gone. Soon it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then it turned around and went back into the field. Then it came out a third time and started toward them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared. They started running. But when they finally stopped, they decided they were being foolish. They weren't sure what had scared them in the first place. So they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm going to try to touch it, then we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered into its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes sunk deep in its head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran, but this time the skeleton followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out in the road for a while, then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. The night that Ted died, Sam said he looked just like the skeleton. That was The Thing, and it's probably one of the better stories in the next chapter. He heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. This chapter focuses on ghost-like spooks, but only one or two of them manage any suspense at all. A couple of them do manage to be kind of creepy and mysterious, like The Thing, but even so, this chapter, and the next one to a lesser extent, really stumbles at the delivery, particularly in the resolution. I still kind of like them, but I'd really have to wonder what a less affectionate critic would say.
Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark has been ranked as the most challenged children's book of all time, so I'm sure that all of the stories are going to be really scary and horrifying and not in the least bit lame. Let's take a look, shall we?
Let's see, here's a story called Cold as Clay. A farmer had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named Jim, but the farmer did not think Jim was good enough for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the country. Soon after she left, Jim got sick and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart.
The male Bella Swan, everybody.
The farmer felt so guilty about Jim's death, he could not tell his daughter what had happened. She continued to think about Jim and the life they might have had together. One night, many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, Jim was standing there. "Your father asked me to get you," he said. "I came on his best horse." "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. Soon he complained of a headache. "It aches something terrible," he told her. She put her hand on his forehead. "Why, you are as cold as clay." "I hope you are not ill," and she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they reached the farm.
He'd completely given up hope of ever seeing her again when he could have reached her in a few hours on a horse. Okay, this guy is worse than Bella Swan.
The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. "Didn't you send for me?" she asked. "No, I didn't," he said. She turned to Jim.
"Can I have your daughter for the rest of her life? Say yes, 'cause I need to know. You say I'll never get your blessing even after I'm dead. Tough love, my friend, but the answer's still no. Well, why you gotta be so rude? Zombie men are people too.
But he was gone. So was the horse. They went to the stable to look for them. The horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of Jim. Terrified, her father told her the truth about Jim's death. Then quickly he went to see Jim's parents. They decided to open his grave.
Well, let's see. The asshole who killed our son comes to our door saying they saw him out of his grave obsessing about his daughter again. That sounds like a good reason to defile his grave. Let's do it.
The corpse was in its coffin, but around its head they found the girl's handkerchief.
Oh my gosh, Jim really was dead, just like they told us at the very beginning. Oh wow, what a twist. In fact, that's almost as shocking as if I said that I'm really a guy named Faylene Portis doing an internet review.
Let's see, how about this story called A New Horse? Two farmhands shared a room. Totally platonically, of course. One slept at the back of the room, the other slept near the door. See? After a while, the one who slept near the door began to feel very tired. Early in the day, his friend asked what was wrong. "An awful thing happens every night," he said. "A witch turns me into a horse and rides me all over the countryside."
Okay, old farmhand buddy of mine, I'm just gonna go call the nice therapist for disturbing childhood abuse now.
No, he just offers to trade beds with him and see what happens. About midnight, an old woman who lived nearby came into the room. She mumbled some strange words over the farmhand, and he found he couldn't move.
Yeah, I bet you're really happy you thought of that trade beds idea now, huh?
Then she slipped a bridle on him, and he turned into a horse. The next thing he knew, she was riding him across the fields at breakneck speed, beating him to make him go even faster.
You know, there definitely seems to be a subtext to this story that I'd rather not talk about.
Soon they came to a house where a party was going on. There was a lot of music and dancing. They were having a big time inside. She hitched him to a fence and went in. When she was gone, the farmhand rubbed against the fence until the bridle came off, and he turned back into a human being. Then he went into the house and found the witch. He spoke those strange words over her, and with the bridle, he turned her into a horse.
So does that mean that he's a witch now? Because he's certainly about to become more of an asshole than she ever was.
Then he rode her to a blacksmith and had her fitted with horseshoes. After that, he rode her to the farm where she lived. I have a pretty good filly here, he told her husband, but I need a stronger horse. Would you like to trade? The old man looked her over, and he said he would do it. So they picked out another horse, and the farmhand rode away. Her husband led his new horse to the barn. He took off the bridle and went to hang it up, but when he came back, the new horse was gone. Instead, there stood his wife, with horseshoes nailed to her hands and feet.
It's actually kind of a funny story, honey. And by funny, I mean incredibly awkward and disturbing.
Oh my gosh, why do you have horseshoes nailed to your hands and feet? Who did this to you?
Well, actually, I kinda was that horse you traded for this morning. Just like I'm not really Faline Portis either. I'm a guy doing a really bad impression of him for Halloween.
Oh, meta.
Let's see, this one's called May I Carry Your Basket? Sam Lewis spent the evening playing chess at his friend's house. Nerd. It was about midnight when they finished their game, and he started home. And I think it's safe to say he didn't win, based on what we'll see in a minute. Outside it was icy cold and quiet as the grave. As he came around a turn in the road, he was surprised to see a woman walking ahead of him. She was carrying a basket covered with a white cloth. When he caught up to her, he looked to see who it was, but she was so bundled up against the cold, it was hard to see her face. "Good evening," said Sam. "What brings you out so late?" But she didn't answer. Then he said, "May I carry your basket?" She handed it to him. From under the cloth, a small voice said, "That's very nice of you." And that was followed by wild laughter. Sam was so startled that he dropped the basket, and out rolled a woman's head. He looked at the head, and he stared at the woman. "It's her head!" the Einstein cried, and he started to run, and the woman and her head began to chase him.
You know, somehow neither of these parties sound very difficult to outrun here, I gotta say.
Come on, Head! I need you to keep up so I can tell which way he went! Hurry up! You always roll so slowly with no limbs to guide you!
But no, soon the head caught up to him. It bounded into the air and sunk its teeth into his left leg. Sam screamed with pain and ran faster, but the woman and the head stayed right behind them. Soon the head leaped into the air and bit into his other leg, and then they were gone.
Aren't you glad you just heard the story of a severed head's plan to bite some guy on the leg twice? Yeah, me neither.
Come on, there's got to be at least one scary story in here. Let's see, The Haunted House. This sounds like a classic. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement, as you do. This house had been haunted for about 10 years. You know, we can keep track of those things and everything. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So it's definitely real, is it? No ifs, ands, or buts. Just like, yeah, that's the house where the haunt lives. Whatever. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house. Went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. Sat there reading the Bible. That is a sentence fragment. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then, it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then, there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little. But finally, he opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating, trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 step. Closer and closer. Step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob turned slowly, and the door opened wide. This time, the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled. The flesh was dropping off her face, so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was sort of a blue light in the back of her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. And she said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest.
Oh, is that all? Well, in that case, I'll get right on that. Thank you for telling me, Miss Ghost. And by the way, could you also tell me where to find the guy who did this to you so we can hang him? Oh, and you'll even throw in instructions on where to find the money he hid? Well, thank you very much, Miss Ghost. You've been a big help. So in conclusion, I can give the title 1 point for being accurate about the fact that you should tell this to people in the dark. That way you can see that nobody is actually getting scared. I'm gonna quit while I'm ahead on this one. They Eat Your Eyes, They Eat Your Nose. And this one focuses on supernatural dangers other than ghosts. Some of them go for gross out, which is actually pretty fun. Including this one here, The Dead Man's Brains, which teaches you how to play that game where you dare people to reach into bowls filled with peeled grapes or mushy tomatoes and say their eyes or brains or something like that. Classic. Now some of them are kind of stupid, like a story in which a girl literally scares herself to death, or this one you may recognize called May I Carry Your Basket. But others, like Alligator or The Wendigo, have a lot of fun with the supernatural possibilities and all their creepy and cheesy glory. Really, this chapter is probably at least a lot more worthwhile than the next one, which is very brief and all about urban legends you've probably already heard, because they've been used as the inspiration for who knows how many things at this point. Actually, I'm tempted to skip that one altogether, because at this point, that kind of thing is probably best left to a specialist.
What are you talking about? Nobody reads anymore.
Poison sting, wrath and spite. Will you survive the shadow of eye? Will you survive the black of the night? King Cobra rises with your demise.
Hello, Overviewer here. Sorry I haven't been around much these past 2 months. I've been making some changes. Like, I moved to a new house, for one, and now I review scary stories. Like these. Scary stories. To tell in the dark.
The chapter we're looking through today actually has some of the urban legends that would be the basis for some of the movies I've already reviewed. They named it Other Dangers, which has to be the laziest damn name I've ever heard. I mean, seriously, they couldn't think of anything more creative. Still, they're all here. The Hook, High Beams, The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, all the classics.
The only one that's not much of an urban legend is The White Satin Evening Gown. The story of a girl too poor to afford a dress for some dance, so she buys it at the local pawn shop, and the next morning she keels over dead. The rest of the story goes, and I quote,
The coroner found she had been poisoned by embalming fluid. It had stopped her blood from flowing. There were traces of the fluid on her dress. He decided it had entered her skin when she perspired while she was dancing. The pawnbroker said he bought the dress from an undertaker's helper. It had been used in a funeral for another young woman, and the helper had stolen it just before she was buried. And that's it. Next page, completely different story.
It's not a bloody horror story, that's it. Well, I mean, I don't mean when I say bloody, it's not a horror story. It's a story of a girl getting screwed over by a dumbass pawnbroker. I mean, don't we even get to see this undertaker's helper confronted? No, she comes back from the grave and takes revenge on him? Well, you heard it here first, folks. The scariest thing in our story is trace amounts of embalming fluid. Still, the other three are classics, but I do have to take some points off for the delivery.
For example, High Beams isn't as tense as it could have been. You don't really get the sense of a ticking clock, or much of anything for that matter. Just sort of play-by-play. But the biggest crime has to be in The Babysitter, where the killer isn't telling her to check the children who are there with her. Instead, he's telling her that he'll be by in an hour or so every single time.
Well, what the heck's he waiting for? And for that matter, why does he keep calling her if not to lure her upstairs? Just to get her to call the police on him? Because that's what she does. And he gets caught without a fight. I don't think I like this version very much. So what's my final verdict? Well, if you're pissed, these stories might pass the time for you. But if you're not pissed, these stories will leave you pissed. They're not very good. They're kind of annoying. But even so, I guess they are classic, and I did genuinely enjoy 2 of the 4, so I give Other Dangers from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark 2.5 White Satin Evening Dresses out of 5. Well, better luck next time.
Hello?
This is the Viper. I'm 10 blocks away.
Hello?
This is the Viper. I'm 6 blocks away.
Who is this? Hello? Hello?
This is the Viper. I'm 1 block away.
Look, I don't know who the hell this is, but if you call me again, I'm calling the police. Look, he's called me 3 times, and I don't recognize the number. Can you please just send someone over? Alright. Thanks, bye.
Hi, I am the Window Viper. I come to wipe and wash the windows.
That's right, the last section is all about horror stories that end with a punchline. Always leave them laughing, right? It's also called Ah because the delivery is much like in the first chapter. But does it hold up just as well?
The slithery D, he came out of the sea. He ate all the others, but he didn't eat me. The slithery D, he came out of the sea. He ate all the others, but he didn't eat me.
Okay, maybe that wasn't the funniest thing I ever heard. To make it up to you, allow me to read to you the story of Aaron Kelly's bones. Aaron Kelly was dead. They bought him a coffin and had a funeral and buried him. But that night, he got out of his coffin and he came home. His family was sitting around the fire when he walked in. He sat down next to his widow and he said, "What's going on? You all act like somebody died. Who's dead?" His widow said, "You are." "I don't feel dead," he said. "I feel fine." "You don't look fine," his widow said. "You look dead. You'd better go back to the grave where you belong." "I'm not going back to that grave until I feel dead," he said. Since Aaron wouldn't go back, his widow couldn't collect his life insurance. Without that, she couldn't pay for the coffin, and the undertaker said he would take it back. Aaron didn't care, bastard. He just sat by the fire, rocking in a chair and warming his hands and feet. But his joints were dry, his back was stiff, and every time he moved, he creaked and cracked. One night, the best fiddler in town came to court the widow. Since Aaron was dead, the fiddler wanted to marry her. Awkward? The two of them sat on one side of the fire, and Aaron sat on the other side, creaking and cracking. "How long do we have to put up with this dead corpse?" the widow asked. "Something must be done," the fiddler said. "This isn't very jolly," Aaron said. "Let's dance." The fiddler got out his fiddle and began to play. Aaron stretched himself, shook himself, got up, and took a step or two, and began to dance. With his old bones rattling, and his yellow teeth snapping, and his bald head wagging, and his arms flip-flopping, around and around he went. With his long legs clicking, and his knee bones knocking, he skipped and pranced around the room. How that dead man danced! But pretty soon a bone worked loose and fell to the floor. "Look at that," the fiddler said. "Play faster," said the widow. The fiddler played faster. Crickety-crack, down and back, the dead man went hopping. His dry bones kept dropping this way, that way, and pieces just kept popping. "Play, man, play," the widow said. The fiddler fiddled, and dead Aaron danced. Then Aaron fell apart, collapsed in a pile of bones, all except his bald head bone. That grinned at the fiddler, cracked its teeth, and kept dancing. "Look at that," groaned the fiddler. "Play louder," cried his widow. "Ho, ho," said the head bone. "Ain't we having fun?" The fiddler couldn't stand it. "Widow," he said, "I'm going home." And he never came back. The family gathered up Aaron's bones and put them back in the coffin. They mixed them up so he couldn't fit them together. After that, Aaron stayed in his grave. But his widow never did get married again. Aaron had seen to that. Hilarious! He ruined her plans for the rest of her life. Hee hee! I'm sorry, I have no idea what that was. Wow. A businessman arrived at a hotel late one night and asked for a room. The room clerk told him the hotel was all filled up. "There is only one room," he said, "but we don't rent that one because it is haunted." "I'll take it," said the businessman. "I don't believe in ghosts." The man went up to the room. He unpacked his things, and he went to bed. As soon as he did, a ghost came out of the closet. Its fingers were bleeding, and it was moaning, "Bloody fingers, bloody fingers." When the man saw the ghost, he grabbed his things and ran. The next morning, a woman arrived very late. Again, all the rooms were taken, except the haunted room. "I'll sleep there," she said. "I'm not afraid of ghosts." As soon as she got into bed, the ghost came out of the closet. Its fingers were still bleeding. It still was moaning, "Bloody fingers, bloody fingers," and the woman took one look and ran. A week later, another guest arrived very late. He also took the haunted room. After he unpacked, he got out his guitar and he began to play. Soon the ghost appeared. As before, its fingers were bleeding, and it was moaning, "Bloody fingers, bloody fingers." The man paid no attention. He just kept strumming his guitar, but the ghost kept moaning, and its fingers kept bleeding. Finally, the guitar player looked up. "Cool it, man," he said. "Get yourself a Band-Aid." And yes, that is how Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark goes out. Get yourself a Band-Aid. Well, I gotta say, in spite of some cheesy moments and some storytelling that really just wasn't up to par, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is classic stuff, and the perfect kind of book to get out at this time of the year to get your friends or your kids into the Halloween spirit. And as for its reputation as the most challenged and censored book of all time, well, it's true I wouldn't read it to everyone, so you might want to take into account which kids are especially sensitive to this kind of thing. But one of my personal heroes once had a quote, saying that kids can handle pretty much anything as long as you attach a happy ending. And, honestly, there is some truth in that. The point of most, if not all of these stories, is not for bad things to happen to characters we're supposed to be invested in. It's for getting us into how unsettling and uncertain each of these scenarios can be. And, honestly, this is not real gore. This is fantastical, spooky story-type gore that really isn't much worse than what kids take in every day, in my opinion, even on the Disney Channel, if you think about it. So, well, not only do I think that kids can handle this, I think it's exactly what they're looking for. Kids like to be scared in vague, mysterious sort of ways. It's exciting, and it gets their imaginations pumping. I do wish I had a scarier note to end on, but, well, this book chose to go out with the comedy section, so I guess that's totally what we're going to do as well. Who did that? Hello? Guys, I'm seriously not in the mood for this.
Hello? Second opinion? Where are you? I was just trying to get you back for the Viper. Hello?
There was a man who lived in Leeds.
Okay, seriously,
Filled
very
his
funny.
garden full of seeds, and when the seeds began to grow,
Okay,
it was like a
where
garden
are
filled
you?
with snow. And when the snow began to melt, it was like a ship
Seriously?
without a belt. And when the ship began to sail, it was like a bird
Okay,
without
where are
a
you?
tail. And when the bird began to fly, it was like an eagle in the sky.
You know how
and when
creepy
the
you're being?
sky began to roar, it was like a lion at my door.
Okay.
And when the door began to crack, it was like a knife right in my back.